So, hi Sean, how are you this morning?
Good, good. How are you, Russell?
Yeah, I'm very good, thank you. So, let's start by talking about the I in identity threat detection and response. So, could you explain why and how the I in identity has become the cornerstone of security, and more specifically, maybe zero trust security?
I like to start conversations around identity with an anecdote of how, people that call themselves identity professionals used to just describe themselves as administrators, and identity was just sort of one small corner of the IT universe. And we would go to identity focused conferences, and there would be 100 people there or a couple hundred people there, nothing more than that. But what we've seen over time is we've seen identity move to the center of security because of the evolution from on premises into the cloud. And what I've seen as I've gone to conferences over the years is the number of people increase and increase and increase. And so, for example, this year in Identiverse, they're expecting about 2,000 people to come to an identity focused conference. That's in the beginning of next month. So there's been a huge upturn in the interest of identity and specifically how it relates to security. And you know zero trust has been tossed around, and we all have our there's like there's a hype cycle of phrases, and everybody's sick of hearing about zero trust. But it's a valid concept, the concept that you can't trust the network, you can't trust the things that you used to traditionally be able to trust in a traditional IT network. But one of the things to trust in a zero trust network, literally the first pillar of zero trust is identity. You can no longer assume that a network is trusted. You can no longer assume that many of the configurations you thought were trustworthy, and therefore you could not have to monitor or not have to secure the activity in those environments anymore. That they don't hold true anymore. The what we tend to talk about is the fact that there are no trusted networks in the cloud, but really the way we should all be thinking nowadays is that there's no trusted networks on premises either. The old saw, the people that think they haven't been broken in have already, there are those that have been compromised, and there are those that will be compromised. But I think it's probably safe to say that it's pretty much everybody has been compromised at this point. So the concept of zero trust is, number one, trust the identity and continually re-verify the identity of the person that is trying to access the resource. It's identity and then access control to the resource. So that moves identity to the middle, to the center of security. Because if you have compromised the identity system, and this is where ITDR comes in, if you've compromised the identity system, then you have compromised the security of the environment you're trying to lock down. The old saw,
Mhm.
um, threat actors don't break in, they log in, is still super, super relevant.
Yeah, and I guess this has become especially important as we have, more people working from different locations, especially post-COVID and the new kind of normal situation for many people in terms of from where they need to access corporate resources.
Yeah, I mean, in it depends on the organization, but for example, an organization like mine, you want to talk about the number of different networks that clients or endpoints are on. It's as many people in the company because everybody's working from home. And so yes, you can every endpoint is essentially working in an untrusted network right now.
So if before, I suppose organizations might have focused on things like their perimeter firewall, antivirus, those kind of things. What we're saying now, if I understand correctly, is as you mentioned, the first pillar is identity. So, assumedly, we need to check, constantly monitor the security of those identities and make sure that they haven't been compromised.
Right, right. There's sort of two parts to it. There is confirming the identities themselves. And so, for example, you
Mhm,
have, MFA in addition to passwords, and whatever they're worth today. They're not really worth anything today. So you have the confirmation of the user's identity, but there's also the protection of the identity system itself that contains those accounts and then uses those identities and assigns permissions to those identities. So if you've compromised one and you haven't compromised another, you have an issue. If you've compromised
mhm,
both, it's game over.
mhm. Well, that provides a very nice segue to my next question, because I know that Azure Active Directory, for instance, has various features built into it to at least, check for identity compromise. But what if you're running on-premises Active Directory? How do organizations protect, well, Active Directory itself and the identities that are managed within that system?
Well, it's pretty loose, I'm afraid, for most organizations. The typical configuration is an Active Directory is a distributed application, so you have multiple domain controllers providing the services. So you have some kind of a collection system, typically nowadays a seam or maybe a SOAR, to collect security logs from all of the domain controllers and uh, collect them and correlate them and try to scrub for specific events that pop up in the event log to then alert on. There are several issues with this sort of traditional approach. And the first is that there are attacks out there, and there continue to be more and more attacks out there that are designed to bypass the security log or otherwise obfuscate what's being done uh, in the environment by not showing it in the security log or by compromising the security log itself. The other is that if you do find something in the security log and you think there is something that's unauthorized that's happened, it's very difficult to do something about it in Active Directory. There's no, with the exception of deleted accounts and what's in the recycle bin, there are no easy ways to undo changes that have been made in Active Directory. So if a threat actor makes changes to an account to gain themselves privileges, for example, it's difficult to go and undo that quickly. Or if they make um, sophisticated changes and you discover it far after the fact, it can be very difficult to undo some of these changes. As I said,
Mhm,
these are manual actions, and then it sort of becomes a game of cat and mouse against the threat actor. And if they get ahead of you, if they get administrative rights ahead of you, they can theoretically lock everybody else out of the system and then do whatever it is that they want to do. The
mhm,
rollback mechanisms for AD are challenging. Using out of box tools, you have to mount backups and do authoritative restores and um, copy contents over. It's not for the faint of heart, and it's not
mhm.
for unsophisticated AD admins to be able to do with any kind of
Yeah, yeah.
speed.
So that's what I wanted to ask you. Surely, if a threat actor makes a significant change, at least to Active Directory, then the only way to roll that back is essentially to restore a backup. Yeah.
Well, there are significant changes, and yes. So, for example, you can make changes to objects and attributes in Active Directory, or it could be a threat actor. It could also be an administrator that does an oops. I like to joke, you never want to be sitting around in a cubicles with a bunch of administrators and hear someone say oops. It generally means that the rest of the day is going to be pretty bad.
Mhm,
There are ways to recover from that, but you have to mount backups and m- or snapshots and come up with to determine what the problem was and do
mhm,
authoritative restores on single domain controllers and then let them replicate out. It's very complicated
mhm.
and
Yeah.
and not speedy. So if a threat actor is actively attacking your Active Directory, the responses that you're able to do are far too slow to counter what they're
Mhm,
doing.
mhm. And I guess if you don't get the restore process right first time, you've got to do it again. And because it's not speedy, that can also add to the length of time it would take to do a successful restore, I guess. Yeah. If you're
Right.
using the native tools. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So this is what you're talking about is sort of the larger, more ugly case is where a threat actor has actually compromised Active Directory. So they have, for example, if you discover that you have malware that is resident on a domain controller, that's a really bad sign because it means that to install software or place software on a domain controller, the threat actor has had to gain administrative rights to the Active Directory domain or the forest, which means you have lost, they have access to the entire, they have access to a domain controller, they have access to the whole forest,
Mhm,
which means you can no longer trust it because you don't know what else the threat actor has done.
mhm, mhm.
That's bad with a capital B, and that's where we get into talking about the recovery that you were referencing, which is a forest recovery. And you use a forest recovery process uh, f- to regain trust in Active Directory by essentially rebuilding it. You break it down into its very basic components. You run a bunch of reset operations on it, and then you build it back out again. And it is, and I'm not overstating the fact, a nightmare to go through. You can ask any Active Directory administrator that has ever been through a forest recovery process, and they'll tell you they never want to do it again. And that's let's not discount the fact that this is happening while the company is compromised and the businesses are down and everybody's waiting for it. So it's an extraordinarily high stress environment to have to do this complicated process. As you mentioned, if you get something wrong, you have to go back and start all over again.
So how do organizations prepare for the fact that they might at some point need to perform that kind of, as you said, full forest recovery?
This is where we run into preparation meets human nature, Russell. So, in my experience, most organizations really aren't prepared for it. They
Mhm,
think they are. They'll take conventional backups, which in this forest recovery process that I described, that process has 28 steps that you have to go through, and and sometimes more than that, depending on how many domain controllers you have. So you go through that process, and conventional backup and recovery solutions basically help you on one step of those 28 steps. So
mhm,
that's
mhm.
the situation they find themselves in. And there is a published doc, a set of documents on the Microsoft site that describes how to go through a forest recovery process, but they're very, very generic. They're not at all customized to your environment, what domain controllers you have to do, what steps you have to take. Most organizations, I mean, there's a spectrum. I would say a lot of organizations have basically looked at the forced recovery process and they've done lip service for it, but they have not taken it themselves, set it aside, and really worked through how do I build a procedure for my company? And if they have done that, great. You're now at the table stakes for recovery in case something bad happens. You still have to go through this immensely complicated and stressful process to do the recovery. So that's the situation most organizations find themselves in. Some
Mhm.
have done uh, some have done tabletop exercises for forest recovery. Some have actually gone through them, but it is very, very difficult with manual tools and manual processes to go through this recovery process. So most organizations, even the best of them, have gone through this. The very best will have gone through this manually once a year, but it's time consuming, it's expensive because of the human resources, the facilities you have to bring up, and frankly, the skill set. It takes a 400 level skill set in Active Directory to do a forced recovery process. And that's not quite so common in the environment after 23 years, after the product's been out for 23 years.
Yeah, I mean that brings me on to my next point. Obviously, Windows Server Active Directory is a mature product. It's been around, as you say, for more than 20 years. But it seems to me there's a lack of skills available to really, properly deploy and maintain the technology. I mean, if we all remember the famous example of Maersk, I think that's how you pronounce it. Was it a Danish shipping company? I think that seemed to have confused Active Directory replication with backup. And of course, when they realized that their systems had been compromised and it was all too late, they didn't have a backup that they were actually able to use to restore their systems. So I guess that's an extra thing that organizations need to consider is, do they have the skills and the staff on hand to really be able to prepare and perform if they had to a full restore.
You bring up a great point, and this is a mindset because again, because Active Directory's been around for so long, the recognition that replication isn't backup. And historically, so historically, if you just ask people that have been around Active Directory that aren't necessarily AD administrators, I mean, it has a fabulous reputation for reliability. It's just kind of always works. And so you just sort of assume it's part of the fabric like electricity or plumbing because it just always works.
Mhm,
But the reason AD always works is because it was designed against geographic disasters. So if you had a flood or a tornado or a hurricane or an earthquake,
mhm,
something would happen to a data center. And frankly, that's the reason we have individual data centers so that you didn't concentrate all of your eggs in one basket geographically. So you would have a disaster or maybe a power failure or something for a data center, and all the domain controllers for that data center or that region would go down. Well, a well designed AD topology has domain controllers in other locations, and AD will automatically pick up the slack of the remaining domain controllers, will pick up the slack for the domain controllers that have disappeared. Now, the response may be degraded, but AD keeps running.
mhm,
So so people think historically that AD is safe because of the way that AD works like this. That's and
mhm,
replication is part of what underlies that. But the problem with a cyber attack is that it's not geographic. It is network centric. And if your domain controllers are on a network and you don't have really, really rigorous segmentation in place, a piece of malware can compromise or destroy an Active Directory environment in minutes or even seconds. So now, what good does replication do you? Or they will use what is used to be known as a lag site, which is to take one domain
mhm,
controller and cut off the replication for some period of time. Well, the reality is the dwell time for malware in an environment, and I've seen it anywhere listed as anywhere from 14 days up to 200 days, that malware may sit in an environment before it's triggered or before you realize that it's there. But what that means in terms of a domain controller that you have sort of cut off for replication is that it's almost guaranteed to be compromised because there's only so long you can keep a domain controller from replicating itself. So it's an incomplete solution. It is not the solution that you need. And the more sophisticated that malware actors have gotten, the better they've gotten at going in and compromising backup solutions, living off the land so that the threat is not obvious until it's happened. It continually evolves. And so what that really means is you need to work on minimizing the vulnerabilities to your Active Directory, but you also need to have backups that can't be reached and don't have malware on them like conventional backups may have. If you take a conventional backup and the dwell time for uh, for some malware is up to 200 days, your backups are going to have the malware on them. So you have to be able
Mhm.
to think about how are you going to recover Active Directory without the malware on it and to be able to do it quickly.
So, Sean, if I came to you today and let's say I want to deploy on-premises Active Directory, from scratch,
Right.
are there maybe two or three key things you could advise me to do to make sure that my Active Directory stays secure?
We're sure we're actually seeing a fair amount of activity around rebuilding or building pristine Active Directory environments and moving existing Active Directory users and computers and applications into a clean environment because as I said, AD's been around for almost a quarter of a century. And so there's a lot of vulnerabilities that have gotten introduced into an old Active Directory that are very difficult, that can be very difficult to clean out. And so oftentimes what is decided, and there are other circumstances where, for example, in healthcare, with lots of acquisitions, with every acquisition comes another Active Directory forest. So you've got uh, an umbrella organization that has a ton of forests in it, and that all equates to vulnerabilities to a very large attack surface because these other Active Directory forests may not be as well protected as a central corporate forest, but they all have links they have trusts into the central corporate forest. So it's really easy to attack from one of those locations. So yes, consolidations of those forests into a single forest and into potentially a pristine forest is become very relevant. And so we recommend when you build this pristine forest, out of the box, Active Directory is works great but it is not necessarily configured as securely as it could be because the out of the box configuration was designed 23 years ago. So you need to immediately apply security frameworks to it and also run analysis against it to make sure that it is as secure as possible. Semperis offers a free tool called Purple Knight, which is a security assessment tool. It takes a snapshot of your Active Directory environment and shows what vulnerabilities are out there. And right out of the box, Purple Knight will show uh, vulnerabilities in Active Directory that are easily remediated. So you want to be able to start with Active Directory secure. Then, as you migrate, frankly, what you want to do is you want to understand what the vulnerabilities are in your existing environment. For example, you have applications, and these applications may be configured insecurely. You don't want to pick up these applications and migrate them into the new environment exactly the way they were in the old environment because you're just carrying the vulnerabilities forward. So ideally, you want to understand what the vulnerabilities are in your source environment, again, with a tool like Purple Knight, or we also have a sophisticated tool called Forest Druid that does an analysis of your tier zero, in other words, your domain controllers, the identity service aspects of it, and paths into gain domain dominance. You want to analyze that in your source environments to understand how insecure the configuration is so you don't carry them forward into the new environment, in the pristine environment, and thus introducing compromises. So you take those applications, you understand what their vulnerabilities are, you migrate them into the new environment without those vulnerabilities. So you've kept that secure. So that's part of the migration process is keeping the source secure and then working on making the destination keeping the destination secure and then analyzing the source vulnerabilities, moving them into the destination and continuing to monitor so you don't drift aside, which is what happened before. so you don't start the same process all over again.
So let's talk a little bit about the R in ITDR. So
Mm.
when you say respond, do you mean respond manually, or is that something that, we should be trying to automate?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is that, look, if you're finding yourself in breach or you're finding yourself potentially being attacked, you can pretty much guarantee that the bad guys are going to be going through Active Directory. Statistics have shown again and again that more than 90% of breaches or cyber attacks use Active Directory or go through Active Directory. So it's only common sense that you should be monitoring Active Directory for unusual activity because they're probably going to go through there. But to your point, okay, you see something unusual activity. How do you handle the response aspect of it? Well, as I said, it's you can monitor Active Directory, but rolling back changes, especially complicated changes or sophisticated changes, can be very difficult to do. You can look at the list of changes, and it might be multiple attributes have been changed, and to go off and do that manually is time consuming, difficult to get right, and the threat actor is always one step ahead of you. So what you really need is a utility that allows you to see all the changes that are being made to Active Directory, and then, as importantly, allows you to roll them back again without going through a long, complicated multi step process. So you can respond to the threat actor as quickly as the threat actor is making changes. So we have a directory service protector product that monitors every change that is being made in Active Directory. We see every change that is being made in Active Directory because we see the actual Active Directory replication stream. And we have the ability to, with a simple checkbox, to manually roll back an operation that, and let's call it an unauthorized unauthorized change. For example, it could be something as innocuous as a user accidentally locked themselves out, or they had a change that was gone, or maybe it's an administrative change, one of those oops things where an admin accidentally deletes an entire organizational unit and thousands of computers in it, which is really difficult to dig your way out of. Or it's a threat actor and they have made multiple changes in Active Directory. And it's without a tool like this, it's very, very difficult to keep up. But with a tool like this, you can check the check boxes of what the threat actor has done. And maybe it's something that they've done 6 weeks ago as well. You can do an analysis to find what those accounts have done and
Mhm.
roll them back with a simple click of a undo button. And all of these changes will be undone in Active Directory. Or for the really critical things, the ability to automatically roll them back. You can write rules to say, if this happens in the environment, if anybody is added, if a user is added to any privileged group in Active Directory, immediately roll it back and trigger alerts that can be followed up on. That's an aspect of response. Another aspect of response that isn't as widely thought about is the ability in our forest recovery product, our automated forest recovery product, to take a backup. And this is what our incident response teams do, is to take an immediate backup of Active Directory when we come in to assist an organization. ADFR will take a compact malware-free copy of Active Directory, take it offline, restore it in this automated method in an isolated network, and then the incident response team can threat hunt the threat actor to see what they're doing without alerting them in the production environment that they're taking steps against them. Build a response plan in that isolated environment and then execute it in the production environment all at once to kick out the threat actors before they have a chance to respond. And it doesn't become a cat and mouse game back and forth.
Mhm.
It becomes an organized kick them out.
So you said the product takes a malware-free copy of AD offline, But how do you know that it's malware free? Is that like kind of a time-based thing, or how is that determined?
Well, Active Directory forced recovery has a patented process that uses the Microsoft standard backup APIs as it uses the volume shadow VSS writers to take a snapshot of a domain controller. But then what we do is we don't keep the operating system. We only keep the Active Directory components of the
Mhm,
operating system. And so what that means is we're also not keeping the malware that's been
mhm.
sitting on the operating system.
Got
So
it. Mhm,
with that process, we can restore it and we can restore it anywhere because we're also not keeping the hardware abstraction layer of the operating
mhm,
system, all the drivers that are tied to the hardware. So we can recover from a VMware system to
mhm,
an Azure VM or to Hyper-V or to physical or to
mhm,
AWS, which makes this recovery in an isolated environment very, very easy to do. This is
mhm.
what gives our customers the ability to do disaster recovery drills with very, very low effort, whereas before it was a significant amount of work to get it done.
Right, that's really interesting. So let's talk about Azure Active Directory again for a little bit. Obviously, Azure AD isn't on-premises Active Directory. It's something that was built kind of from the ground up, as far as I kind of understood from what Microsoft has said about it in the
Right.
past. So what I mean by that, it's not just Active Directory running in the cloud. Yeah, it's something that was kind of designed for, the cloud and the different threat landscape that we have, even though Azure AD is already quite old, I suppose. I don't know how long it's been around, 7, 8 years at least by now, I would imagine,
Mhm.
something like
Yeah,
that.
that's about right.
Um, but, Microsoft is investing in it, they're developing it. It has some ITDR features built into it. But are they enough, or do organizations need to supplement what Microsoft provides in its, cloud identity service?
Well, as you say, Azure Active Directory has is it's actually I've been covering Azure Active Directory since it was first announced, and I scratching my head to try to figure out what it was. But one thing it is not, as you say, is Active Directory. It at a high level, it does what we call the four A's of an identity system of accounts and auditing and access control. And I'm spacing out on what the fourth A is right now, but authentication. So the state of Azure Active Directory is obviously they maintain the landscape. They maintain the
Mhm.
underlying
Yep.
configuration and all of that. And should you have something catastrophic happen, it can be pulled back. But what it doesn't really track outside of the recycle bin for accounts, similar to on-prem Active Directory. It doesn't track all of the changes that are happening in Active Directory, the role changes, permission changes, group changes in and out, all that sort of thing. So no, those capabilities are not native to Azure Active Directory, and people tend to miss that. And they're also entirely separate from on-premises Active Directory. There's these Azure Active Directory tools don't extend down into Active Directory. And frankly, again, I think for most organizations, most of the identities in their Azure Active Directory are actually originated on premises with Active Directory.
Okay, so what you're saying is, if we have like some kind of hybrid environment where on-premises Active Directory is connected to the cloud Azure Active Directory, those protection features that do exist inside Azure Active Directory won't protect my on-premises Windows Server Active Directory, is what you're saying.
Correct, and vice
Right.
versa under most circumstances that, your
Right.
on-premises Active Directory tools don't help with your Azure Active Directory. Our Directory Service Protector uh, solution does allow you, as I described, to roll back Active Directory objects and attributes and changes. And with the release of our version 3.8, which is just coming out on the market, we have the ability to roll back Azure Active Directory changes as well. So that's a big lift, and you can use DSP to look at an Active Directory object, a user or a group, and see what their status is on premises, and also see that account which has been projected up into Azure Active Directory via synchronization, to see what its properties are in Azure AD. You could have a user that is a regular user on premises that is has administrative rights in Azure Active Directory, and you have to, as an admin of your organization is this hybrid environment. You need to be able to understand what this particular identity is and what its value is and what its vulnerabilities are across the hybrid environment, not just one or the other, but a holistic view.
So, if an organization wants to assess their current security posture in terms of Active Directory, you mentioned Purple Night. Is that something that would allow them to get a relatively comprehensive picture of their security posture?
Yes, Purple Knight right now. So our current version of Purple Knight will analyze both Active Directory and Azure Active Directory for vulnerabilities, indicators of exposure. I think right now Purple Knight examines about 110 uh, different indicators of exposure for Active Directory, 110 different vulnerabilities, and about 20 or so for Azure Active Directory. There are fewer for Azure Active Directory. Hopefully, that's certainly the trend we want it to be. But that will allow you to see and generate a report to sort of give you a scorecard of what your vulnerability landscape looks like in your hybrid identity environment, and it will set up for the most important vulnerabilities, the most important indicators right up at the top. Critical vulnerability, this is where it fits in the MITRE ATT&CK framework or the ANSI framework. Here, here's a description of what the vulnerability means, and here are the steps you should take to remediate that vulnerability. So yes, and again, the other one is Forest Druid. It's a more sophisticated tool, takes a little more work to understand what it does, but it will show you the paths that can be traversed to get to control your identity system. Is very, very important. Is you want to be able to either eliminate those paths to your tier zero or understand what they are and know what needs to be monitored to protect it.
Yeah, I love the fact that Purple Knight gives you actionable steps, not just this is what's wrong, but how do
Right,
you actively go and fix the problem?
right,
Because obviously that may not always be clear. So it's great that it provides some guidance.
right.
Purple Knight is a free tool, if I remember correctly.
That's right. So Purple Knight
Yeah.
will do a snapshot in time of your security configuration. And our directory
Mhm.
service protector tool has more security indicators, and it does the monitoring continually. So as you fix things in your environment, your score will go up, and DSP will show that over time, and we have organizations that do this, will track their score, their percentage score, so they can show to management how it gets better over time, how they're making their environment more secure against threats.
And Forest Druid, is that something that people can just download and use, or where does that fit into the product picture?
Yes, Forest Druid is also a free download. As I said, it's a little more sophisticated because it
Mhm.
requires a knowledge of how Tier Zero works and attack path analysis. But there are other tools. There's some skill set in the environment about attack path analysis and the understanding of how it works. So with a little practice, it will show you quite clearly and full graphics exactly what that looks like and where those vulnerabilities stand out.
So, where can people find out more about these tools, Sean, if they would like to download and use them?
So I would go to the semperis.com website, semperis.com, and you can find links to Purple Knight there and Forest Druid, and of course our award-winning Active Directory Forest Recovery and Directory Service Protectors products as well for uh, exactly these reasons we've been discussing today.
Okay, great, great. Well, I think I would definitely encourage everybody to go out and have a look at Purple Knight. Definitely, I've seen that in action. I've yet to see Forest Druid, so I'm quite interested to see how all of that works as well. But yeah, don't become a statistic and make sure that your Active Directory is properly secured and that you know how to restore it should you need to do that to make sure that you're prepared.
Yeah, you
Okay.
don't want to get that phone call at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning and not know what you're in for.
All right. Well, thanks very much for your time today, Sean. It's been a very interesting conversation. And thanks for watching the video. And I hope that we will speak again soon.
Thanks, Russell. It's always good to have a conversation.
Thank you.